I think this is for the third time that I'm welcoming people to this webinar on science diplomacy and environmental peace building. I'm very happy that we had a few technical glitches, and I'm happy that we have worked it out somehow. Yes, and so we had our first session, in fact, in April on science diplomacy and environmental peace building, and this was focused on the Mediterranean region. And we had two speakers who spoke about their initiative on Science for Peace initiative in Cyprus. Today, in fact, our session is actually going to focus on the polar regions, the Arctic and the Antarctic, which many people refer to as the global commons, at least in the case of the Antarctic. And of course, many people believe that even the Arctic should be treated as a global common, and the economic opportunities and immense resources that the region has should be treated as common goods. However, of course, there are plenty of geopolitical contestations and geoeconomic interests that are involved in these regions, which makes science diplomacy, environmental diplomacy, and peace building kind of complicated. And this is what our speakers of the day, Dr. Klaus Dodds, who's a professor of geopolitics at Department of Geography, Royal Holloway, University of London, and Dr. Cassandra Brooks, assistant professor in environmental studies, University of Colorado Boulder, will be talking about. Before I go into what they will be speaking about, I would just like to mention the networks and institutions that have helped make this particular webinar possible. So, of course, I'm thankful to Center for Climate Studies, Manipal Academy of Higher Education, of which I'm the co-coordinator, which is primarily responsible for organizing this webinar. But I'm also very thankful to Environmental Peace Building Association, the Earth System Governance Project, Early Career Researchers Network of Networks and Future Earth, Young Ecosystem Services Specialists, Network of Early Career Sustainable Scientists and Engineers, International Consortium of Research Staff Associations, Responsible Research and Innovation Networking globally, and Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services Fellows. So it's a long list of networks which has, expressed interest in this particular webinar series, and I'm very happy to express their thankfulness to them. So I'm not going to waste too much of time. I would like to invite the two speakers to talk about their work on the polar regions, especially in terms of geopolitics and marine conservation and other issues related to science diplomacy in those regions. And in this respect, let me first invite Dr. Klaus Dodds, who is a professor of geopolitics at the University of London. Before I invite him, let me also give a brief introduction to his work. He has published many authored and edited books, including the Research Companion on the Politics of the Antarctic, Scramble for the Poles, The Contemporary Geopolitics of the Arctic and Antarctic, Global Geopolitics, A Critical Introduction, Polar Geopolitics, Knowledges, Legal Regimes and Resources, and the Arctic, What Everyone Needs to Know. So these are just some of the publications to his name. And apart from his achievements in various arenas, I would just like to mention a few. In November 2016, he was awarded a major research fellowship by the Leverhulme Trust for a project examining a new north, the making and remaking of the global Arctic, and he's also a council member of the Canada-UK Council and a member of the UK Arctic-Antarctic Partnership. Apart from that, he has worked for the UK Parliament as specialist advisor to a House of Lords Select Committee on the Arctic and the House of Commons Environment Audit Committee. So as you can see, he is very experienced in the area of polar regions, especially in terms of geopolitics and a topic like science diplomacy, which is, of course, an emerging area. Okay, so I will hand over to Klaus Dodds now to speak about the topic that he has suggested, of course, is science diplomacy in the polar regions. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the kind introduction. And it's a great pleasure to be here with you. And let's hope the technical gremlins don't cause us any more disruption. Anyway, so the focus this afternoon is on science diplomacy in the polar regions, and I think what I would say is, to start with, is that on the one hand, science diplomacy and geopolitics seem to be very odd bedfellows, because when we think of the term science diplomacy, which really became increasingly popularized, I think, in the 2000s, we often think of activities, actors, and places that should be far removed from the business of geopolitics. The whole point of science diplomacy is to work with the register of soft power and to try and avoid what is often thought of as the geopolitical, which is probably more conflictual, more confrontational, anything but Pacific. But what I think many of us who work in these fields, whether it's geography, whether it's conservation, whether it's political science, international relations, recognize is that actually geopolitics is part and parcel of science diplomacy, and that might actually be quite awkward for those who are engaged with science diplomacy, in particular scientists who may not think of themselves as geopolitical actors. But governments do recognize that science diplomacy is very much part and parcel of prevailing geopolitics. My own country, the United Kingdom, has at this current moment in time a network of something like 100 science and innovation officers operating in 47 countries. And if you were to actually look at where they operate in terms of the 47 countries, you very quickly discover that there are these really fundamental geographies to science diplomacy as well. So one of the most important areas to the United Kingdom at the moment when it comes to science diplomacy is Russia. We are really keen to use science diplomacy to try and foster better relations with Russia, because the United Kingdom and Russia have had a very awkward relationship, in particular in the last 10 years. So that's my first and fundamental point, is that science diplomacy and geopolitics are very, very much interrelated. Turning to the polar regions, this relationship, of course, is important because for many polar scientists, if you were to interview them, as I've done over the years, they often express a disinterest in geopolitics, that actually what they're really concerned with is fundamental science, and often take great pleasure in working in these extraordinary environments that are the Antarctic and the Arctic. But as I want to just briefly outline to you, geopolitics has been absolutely integral to the making of the polar regions as an object of governance, but it's also been integral to the workings of what I call polar geopolitics. Now, the first thing to bear in mind is that the polar regions, despite their remoteness, have actually had, for at least 150 years, a history of international involvement and collaboration. If we go back to the first polar year of 1882 to 1883, 12 nations were involved in the Arctic in areas of common interest. We move on to the second International Polar Year of 1932-1933. We have something like 44 nations involved in international collaboration of some sort or another. The most important, I would argue, was the International Geophysical Year of 1957-58, sometimes called the Third International Polar Year. And this saw 67 countries involved in a truly global enterprise of scientific activity, with 12 in particular being involved in the Antarctic. And that proved really transformational to Antarctic geopolitics, because it really ushered in the era of permanent human occupation of Antarctica and led to really substantial investment in polar infrastructure. And then the final International Polar Year, just to complete the quartet, was in 2007 to 2009, which involved 60 countries. And notably, probably more so in the Arctic, really witnessed, I think, substantial engagement with indigenous and northern communities in the Arctic. And that was something, I think, quite distinct. But one of the things that the history of the International Polar Years remind us is not only that a large number of countries were involved, and of course thousands of scientists over the years, but actually the way in which the Arctic and Antarctic were involved in these International Polar Years also varied. So in the International Geophysical Year of 1957-1958, much of the, if you like, scientific activity in the polar regions was really focused on the Antarctic. And the Arctic was really comparatively marginal, in large part because of Cold War geopolitics. It was difficult to get the United States and the Soviet Union to think about the Arctic in a sort of more scientific domain, because, of course, it becomes so utterly militarized as a result of ongoing tension between the two countries and their allies. But I would argue that in the Antarctic in particular, science diplomacy is and was utterly integral to the shaping of the governance. We would not have had the Antarctic Treaty of 1959 had we not had an extraordinary amount of what we would now call science diplomacy. Science not only provided a language for parties to eventually find agreement on how to go about their business in the Antarctic, but I think also scientific culture, scientific values, and the sort of intellectual climate that surrounded science also provided a sort of lubricant for sort of international cooperation and discourse. One of the really important things I think to recognize about so much of this is that the 1950s science enjoyed a sort of prestige and a sort of a sense of authoritative judgment that probably we would find a little bit harder to maintain in this sort of post-truth fake news era, where I think the judgment of expert and expert knowledge is far more likely to be challenged. In the 1950s, it was common to talk about science and prestige as if the two were interrelated. Without science, as I say, the Antarctic Treaty probably would not have flourished and would not have been able to make the really important interventions which led to the Antarctic very much remaining a zone of peace and cooperation. In the Arctic, the story was rather different, and it was really only in the 1970s, a period of relative détente, where the Soviet Union and the United States were able to turn to science and science diplomacy as a form of soft power to encourage, amongst other things, exchanges between American and Soviet scientists. In the post-Cold War era, science diplomacy also played, I think, a very important part in helping to reimagine the Arctic, in particular, as a region of circumpolar cooperation in areas not only of science, but also, crucially, environmental protection and sustainable development. In terms of the Antarctic, however, science probably has had to share increasingly in the last 20, 30 years the political stage with other actors, other ideas, and other forces. So, for example, the 1950s, we could say confidently that Antarctica was largely a continent of and for science. I don't think we could say that now. We'd have to recognize that resource exploitation, tourism, biological prospecting have all complicated what science diplomacy can and can't do. We've had to recognize, for example, that we need to talk about the Arctic and the Antarctic in more explicitly economic, cultural, geopolitical, as well as scientific terms. So for all the talk, for example, of climate change, important though it is, we also have to recognize that there's plenty of other conversations. Science diplomacy does not cover all the possibilities. So quickly, in conclusion, I would say just a couple of things. First of all, whenever we think of science diplomacy, it's what I would call an assemblage of things, actors, objects, and geographical sites. There's nothing simple about science diplomacy. Science diplomacy is multi-faceted and always varied. It's a kind of parliament of things, as Bruno Latour would say. Secondly, it's not a magic bullet. You can't just think and hope that if only we could throw science diplomacy at something, then the disagreements and the conflict we have would go away. Thirdly, in an era of post-truth, fake news, populism, nativism, we have to also recognize that scientific authority does not go unchallenged. And that really relates to the second point as well about the magic bullet. It's not a magic bullet in policy terms, but intellectually, it's more likely to be challenged and not simply accepted. And then finally, are the polar regions still special and exceptional? Is there something about the polar regions that gives us hope that actually there is still a lot of life left in science diplomacy? I certainly think all the interested parties in the Arctic and the Antarctic believe that there is. There is a great deal of faith still being invested in science and science diplomacy. And I just simply end on the point that the United Kingdom is certainly a great believer in science diplomacy. One of the reasons why we invested millions of pounds in a new polar vessel, the Sir David Attenborough, was in essence that we could use the ship as a form of mobile science diplomacy. That ship will be doing a great deal of work in the Arctic and the Antarctic as part of what we now talk about as Global Britain. And I'll end on that note, and you'll be relieved to hear I haven't mentioned the B word.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Dodds, for that brief overview of science diplomacy and environmental diplomacy in the polar regions, which has obviously been complicated with a lot of other factors. And thank you for providing the critical perspective on science diplomacy. Everything is not rosy about terms like science diplomacy or environmental peace building, which are usually used as a positive pathway towards, establishing peace and stability in regions that are especially fraught with conflict. But I'm very happy that you brought out different perspective on this aspect. And yes, so from there, I would like to now invite our next speaker of the webinar, Professor Cassandra Brooks. As I already mentioned, she is an assistant professor in environmental studies at University of Colorado Boulder. She works at the intersection of marine science, environmental policy, and public outreach to achieve conservation solutions. And prior to joining CU Boulder, she completed a PhD at Stanford University studying international ocean policy with a focus on marine protection in the Antarctic. Her research, in fact, helped drive the adoption of the world's largest marine protected area in the Ross Sea, Antarctica, one of the healthiest and most productive marine ecosystems left on Earth. And in the last 20 years, Cassandra's drive to understand and contribute to environmental governance has taken her all over the world, working in different capacities, including as a federal fisheries observer on New England groundfish boats, a National Science Foundation-funded field researcher in Antarctica, a science writer and media producer, and an Antarctic policy advisor for international conservation organizations in the United States, Europe, China, and South Korea. So yes, so obviously from this explanation, it's quite clear that she has had an extensive kind of contribution to research and policy on Antarctica, especially the Ross Sea, which she will be talking about specifically in this talk. So yes, over to you, Cassandra, and I will invite question and answer after both speakers speak so that we have like a continuity. So I hope that's fine with the audience. Okay, over to you, Cassandra, now.
Thank you so much. And I am going to go ahead and show a PowerPoint as I speak. So I want to tell you the story of how we got the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area, how it actually happened. But first, I want to show you where Antarctica is. It's here on the bottom of the world. And I wanted you to think about this place that before we even knew Antarctica existed, before anyone had discovered the continent, that the ancient Greeks insisted that a great southern land must exist in symmetry with the north, Without it, they said, the whole world would topple over. And I love that metaphor because the Greeks were more right than they knew. Because since its discovery, scientists have documented that Antarctica stores 90% of the world's fresh water. It drives global ocean circulation. It regulates our climate. And despite being such a harsh place, the windiest and coldest, and it's actually the driest continent, the waters teem with life. It's very surprising. The waters are below the point of freezing, and yet they are full of marine life. And there was a study that actually came out in Science in 2008, so more than 10 years ago, that did an assessment of human impacts on the marine ecosystems of the world. And this study showed that there's very few places left in the world that still have healthy marine ecosystems. And some of those are in the Arctic, and some of those are in the waters around Antarctica. And this study showed that actually we have very few pockets left where the ocean is healthy. So why are the waters around Antarctica healthier? Part of that is that they're protected by remoteness. They're really far away. Part of it is that they're protected by a shield of ice that forms around the continent every year. But also I want to highlight, as Professor Dodds has really highlighted, the role of science in the Antarctic has been really exceptional. Science a long time ago set up a framework for international collaboration where, despite diplomatic tensions, scientists can always work side by side down in Antarctica. And I want to highlight, as Professor Dodds did, the International Geophysical Year that happened in 1957-58. This happened at the height of the Cold War. There were intense diplomatic tensions in Antarctica. There were competing national claims. There were threats of nuclear war breaking out on Antarctica. And in the midst of all this, there was this dedicated science year focused on understanding Antarctica better in 1957-58. And that International Science Year actually led directly to a political collaboration and the signing of the Antarctic Treaty in 1959, which, as many of you know, and as Professor Dodds alluded to, this treaty set aside the entire continent for the sake of peace and science. And the Antarctic Treaty System collectively grants freedom of science. It prohibits military operations. It prohibits nuclear activities. Antarctica is still one of the largest nuclear-free zones in the world. It suspends sovereignty, and later amendments actually ban mining as well. And I really need to pause and highlight what amazing this is, that the Antarctic continent is a de facto world park. And I truly think it's one of our most marvelous achievements. It shows what is possible, that we actually can, for the greater good, set aside this space for humanity rather than using it for military purposes at the time. But things have changed slightly, and there are other agreements under the Antarctic Treaty System, and one of them is the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, or CAMLR. And CAMLR is the ocean arm of the Antarctic Treaty System. They govern the waters around Antarctica. They've been in place since 1980. It's 25 different nation states, and the picture on the bottom there is a picture of those governments, and during negotiations, that's what the room looks like. And they meet once a year down in Tasmania, Australia, and that's where they make their deliberations. They do make decisions based on consensus, meaning they need unanimous agreement. And they're considered very much a leader in marine resource management. And the reason for that is that if you read the words of the convention, you would see that the language demands a precautionary, science-based ecosystem approach to management. There are two main fisheries down in the Southern Ocean. And when I first started studying Antarctica, I was studying the life history of toothfish, and I'll tell you more about that fish in a minute. But I was very surprised that there were even fisheries down in Antarctica because it is so far away. It truly is the bottom of the world. But krill is one of the biggest things that's exploited, and this is important to know that they are a key prey species in the Southern Ocean food web. Almost everything eats krill, so they're incredibly important to the system. And they are commercially harvested at an industrial level, both for fish meal, so to feed your aquaculture and your chickens and pigs and things like that, and then also for omega-3 pills, which is a very high value market for krill. And then toothfish are the other main animal harvested. There's two species, the Patagonian and Antarctic toothfish. And as these pictures show you, they are a huge fish. They can grow in excess of 2 meters. They are by far the top fish predator in the Southern Ocean. In fact, there's no sharks in Antarctica, so these guys function very much as the shark of this system. And they are harvested largely to be sold as Chilean sea bass on the market in the United States, Asia, and EU as well. Now, I want to highlight, why are we even fishing in Antarctica and how this happened? Well, it's in line with global fishing trends. And this is a figure from the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, showing you that by 2008, 90% of our global fisheries were either collapsed, overexploited, or fully exploited. So what that means is that we've fished out much of the world's oceans, and it leaves very few places left where we actually have room to expand. And the poles are actually one of those places where we still have undiscovered fisheries, both in the Arctic as well as the Antarctic. There are even populations of toothfish in Antarctica that have never been fished so far. So you very much have pressure on this system to find new fish stocks and to exploit them. Meanwhile, we have rapid environmental change happening, and I won't go into this figure more than showing you that areas in red are the areas that we have rapid warming, and the areas in blue we have cooling, just to point out that Antarctica is undergoing rapid dramatic change at this moment in time. And so I want to highlight that marine protected areas, which are essentially areas that you set off limits to fishing or you restrict activities in a certain way, these are a really popular tool for conserving biodiversity and also for enhancing sustainable fisheries. And there's this global movement to develop marine protected areas. The map before you just shows where they are in the world at this time, and they are increasing. Right now, it's about 7.5% of our ocean is protected. And the reason that they're increasingly popular is that they do lead to dramatic increases in biomass, and that's just the amount of stuff living in the water, the density, so how concentrated they are, the size of animals increases, and the species richness or the diversity increases. And on the slide in front of you is just one study that actually did a meta-analysis of more than 100 marine protected areas in almost 30 countries, and they found this across the board, that marine protected areas very much enhance the system, and this helps with fisheries as well. And so just to highlight that, in CAMLR, they've been talking about marine protected areas for a long time. It's part of their legal mandate to do this. And very early on, the Ross Sea Antarctica became a priority area. And I'm showing you the figure again from early on in the talk to highlight that this study actually showed that the Ross Sea was the least damaged of all marine ecosystems left in the world, or to think about it another way, that the Ross Sea was the most pristine marine ecosystem in the world. And that was incredibly powerful to learn that, and it put it on the stage for being a priority area for protection. The Ross Sea is also the most productive stretch of the Southern Ocean. The picture in front of you is actually taken from outer space, and it's of a phytoplankton bloom that happens in the Ross Sea every summer. And this bloom just drives an array of life. There's a disproportionate amount of marine life living in the Ross Sea, including more than a quarter of the world's emperor penguins and more than a third of the world's Adelie penguins. It's also considered a living laboratory because it is this healthy marine ecosystem. It gives us an opportunity as scientists to actually study what a healthy marine ecosystem looks like. And it also is the best studied of Antarctic continental shelf systems. But there are big challenges to getting marine protected areas in Antarctica. Part of that is all of these different countries. They only meet once a year, and so they only have one opportunity each year to actually take policy decisions. And as I mentioned, decisions require consensus, so all the countries have to agree. And inherently, marine protected areas require trade-offs between what do you set aside for protection and where do you allow fishing or other use to continue. And then I'll talk briefly about the geopolitical roadblocks that have nothing to do with fishing at all. So I'm going to use this framework to understand how we build a consensus. And this would apply to any international space that requires consensus, but I'm going to show you how we did it with the Ross Sea in particular. And as I mentioned, there's 25 members that are party to CAMLR. And what we have to do basically is get all of those members to agree to a Ross Sea protected area in this case. And as I mentioned, discussions have been going on for a long time, since the mid-90s. Actually, the UK was a country that even brought the idea of protected areas into CAMLR as something that they should do. In the mid-2000s, there were other countries that hosted workshops. And then by 2012, we got an actual marine protected area proposed to CAMLAR with the boundaries that are in front of you on the screen. And at that time in 2012, half of the CAMLAR members actually supported the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area as it was first proposed. But it took a long time to get all the other countries on board. In 2013, and as I toggle between the screens, you can see this is the proposal in 2012. This is the proposal in 2013. It was reduced in size by 40%, partly to accommodate fishing interests. And that got many more countries on board to support the proposal. In 2014, even more countries came on board, including the Ukraine. And that was an interesting one because Ukraine had voted in unison with Russia on everything up until 2014, at which point they have become very independent and voted on their own. So again, just the role of international geopolitics at play. So that left China and Russia. And I wanted to back out for a minute and show you how this proposal was developed. So this is a close-up of the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area proposal in 2015. And not to get too much into the details other than showing you that this is, the blue shading is conservation planning that was done in areas that are darker blue were more important for biodiversity. And so you can see a lot of the Ross Sea shelf and slope is in that area, but the boundaries of the Marine Protected Area are in black, and they missed a lot of the key areas. And the reason for that is especially Island Bank was a very important area for biodiversity conservation. However, in yellow shows you the main fishing areas for toothfish in the Ross Sea. And so essentially what happened is we wound up with a protected area that omitted the main fishing grounds, and actually the SRZ is a special research zone where some fishing would still be allowed. So just to kind of give you a bit of the weeds of what happens in this planning is that the boundaries are drawn to protect special areas, but then they can accommodate fishing. But it is more complicated than fishing. And just to give you a few examples of how it's more complicated than fishing, this is a map of Antarctic sovereignty claims from the 1950s before the treaty was signed. And some of the marine protected areas actually reflect those old sovereignty boundaries. And so this raises a lot of political questions for countries. So that's one issue. The other issue is where the fisheries are. And so the red bubbles show you where the main krill fisheries are, and green are the main toothfish fisheries. And just to point out that some of the toothfish fisheries function as exclusive economic zones, especially ones that are further north. And so that countries very much have unequal access to these different fisheries. And that comes up almost as an equity issue in negotiations. And this figure just shows you all the different countries and where they're fishing, each flag representing one vessel that notified to fish in the recent season, just to give you a sense of what a busy international space this is for having vessels on the water. And the proposals may interfere with current and future fishing. And so a lot of this has to do with precedent setting. Some countries don't want to have protected areas here because they think that it will have to have protected areas in the Arctic or the high seas or other places. And then I mentioned external geopolitics. And as many of you know, there has been very tense relations, particularly between the US and Russia in recent years. And this really came out in the CAMLAR meeting room. I did a variety of research interviews in 2014, and so many different individuals mentioned that the negotiations over protected areas actually had a Cold War feel to them, it was surprising for me because we're talking about protecting Antarctica, and yet all these international things play out there, providing no political window of opportunity. But I want to just take a minute and back out of the room. I've talked largely about what happens within that negotiation room, but outside of that room, scientists were putting a lot of pressure on CAMLAR. And this is one scientist, Dr. David Ainley, who actually very early on saw fishing happening in the Ross Sea, and he didn't want to see the whole ecosystem change and go down on his watch. And so he started putting papers forward to CAMLAR on how we need a protected area in the Ross Sea so that we actually have this one last place protected, intact. And he led a flood of science efforts. And I'm not going to talk about all these, just to show you on the screen all these different science papers that we put out over the course of 10 years, putting support for a Ross Sea protected area, including a large bioregionalization of what the priority areas were. We got a scientist consensus statement on protecting the Ross Sea. More than 500 scientists signed this. And we just produced a flood of media. And then at the same time, working alongside scientists, we created a team of people to create media, and we branded the Ross Sea as the last ocean. And in fact, to such an extent that on the floor of CAMLAR, the diplomats started referring to the Ross Sea as the last ocean. We produced a flood of media, as I mentioned, in publications all over the world. We produced a documentary film, a book. We got celebrity support, which was super effective at getting the public engaged. And then outside of CAMLR now, every year there are these protests of the public actually putting pressure on these international diplomats to protect Antarctica. And the very important thing I think we did that actually led to real movement was we got the attention of former Secretary of State John Kerry. He actually watched a version of the Last Ocean documentary film in Washington, D.C., and decided that he wanted the Ross Sea to be part of his legacy, and he took it on. And so in this moment, particularly in 2015, we still had China and Russia that were not supporting a Ross Sea protected area. And John Kerry did a lot of work, both through President Obama and other people to get countries on board. And indeed, through high-level negotiations, we heard directly from the State Department, high-level negotiations between the presidents of China and the United States led to movement on a Ross Sea protected area in 2015. And China did support in 2015. They did want some additions and some concessions, which I won't go into, but largely because of that high-level diplomatic pressure, they did support the protected area. And then it came down to getting Russia's support, which in 2016, former Secretary of State John Kerry did work very hard in Russia. And also Russia was isolated, so potentially there was this window of opportunity, and Secretary Kerry would be moving on. It was his sort of last chance to have the Ross Sea be part of his legacy. And there were other things happening in 2016 that led to potential leadership for Russia. And this is also, so the role of countries actually taking leadership, I think, is really important. We had the 200th Antarctic anniversary of Russia actually potentially discovering the continent, and a lot of other things going on. So in 2016, Russia did support a Ross Sea marine protected area. And on October 28th, that was the day that it was actually adopted. And it is the world's largest marine protected area still. It's 1.55 million kilometers squared. 70% of that is strictly no take. But it did require very high level diplomacy to get at some of those geopolitical things. And it did require, as I showed you, some trade-offs in fisheries and ecosystem protection. And it came into force December 1st, 2017. So I just want to close, though, by telling you what it was like being in the room. So I do attend these negotiations, and I started attending CAMLR in 2012. So I was able to observe and study this whole process of getting consensus on a Ross Sea protected area. And in 2016, the meeting went on, and it was literally the last night of this 2-week meeting, and we still didn't have consensus on the Ross Sea. And it was very tense. There were many heads of diplomat negotiations, heads of delegation meetings where they would actually kick everybody out of the room, and only the top diplomat from each country were allowed to negotiate. So it was very difficult to even know what was going on. And finally, I'll never forget when the chair invited everyone back into the room, and he said, "That's it, we have consensus on a Ross Sea protected area." And in that moment, the room exploded in applause. There were countries hugging other countries. There were many of the scientists in particular had tears in their eyes. We, of course, had tears in our eyes. It was a truly amazing thing where after so many years of effort, we finally got consensus on this protected area. And it made me realize that not only was this a huge environmental win for Antarctica and for the world, but it very much felt like a diplomatic win. It felt like a peace agreement where you had countries like the US and Russia agreeing to something like this at the height of all these tensions. It reminded me back to the days of the Antarctic Treaty and showing that we do still have exceptional governance in Antarctica despite tensions and it being this contested resource frontier. And the map in front of you is a map that the CAMLR Secretariat printed out the day after the protected area was adopted. And they invited all the countries that were party to negotiations to come and sign the map. So you will see signatures from Russia and the US, from Uruguay, from South Korea, all these different countries that were incredibly proud of this thing that we all did together. So the map in front of you just shows the adopted protected areas. The Ross Sea one is at the bottom, and then there's another smaller one in the South Orkney Islands. And then in purple is the proposal for additional protected areas. CAMLR has agreed to have a whole network to protect all of the Southern Ocean's biodiversity. So there's still a lot of work to do. But I just want to close with, as I've showed you, the Southern Ocean is certainly a contested resource frontier. There are a lot of tensions over fishing interests, but it also is this exceptional place where we are able to do things that we may not be able to do in other parts of the world because of the history we have there of collaboration and the role of science. So thank you very much. I will stop the slideshow.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Cassandra Brooks, again, for that fantastic presentation. And you have given, like, all the details of the MPA. And in fact, both of you have written a wonderful article for International Relations as well on this particular topic. So those who want to get more information can go back and read this as well. So, okay, I have quite a lot of questions actually here from the audience. So I'm just trying to group them according to who is addressed to, so that I can just save some time as well on that. So I think I'll first start with Professor Dodds. There are a couple of questions for you from Rashmi. So her first question is regarding the CAO agreement, I guess the Central Arctic Ocean Agreement, and she wants to know whether this agreement can be called as an example of science diplomacy in the Arctic. And she also wants to know about the geopolitics in the Arctic. Wait a second. Yeah, she wants to know about the Arctic Council, whether, because of the presence of, say, the observer countries now, like China, India, for instance, is there any chance of reforming the Arctic Council, especially from the point of view of greater involvement of extra-regional countries in this particular region? So that's her second question. There's one more question, but I think I'll, just go step by step. So yeah, Professor Dodds.
Yeah, so thank you again, and thanks in advance to everybody who's sending in questions. It's very much appreciated. So very quickly, the 2018 agreement pertaining to the Central Arctic Ocean, I think could and should be seen as science diplomacy. Science, law, and geopolitics, however, also make the agreement possible. What's really noteworthy here is that the Central Arctic Ocean has been defined using legal criteria. So this part of the Arctic Ocean is defined as the international waters lying beyond the exclusive economic zones of coastal states like Russia and China. And it makes the point, I think, that people like Cassandra have made very powerfully, that these legal areas that we then subject to fisheries management don't always coincide very nicely with the sort of ecological complexities of ocean spaces, whether it's the Southern Ocean or Arctic Ocean. What's notable about the agreement is that it has 10 parties. You've got the 5 Arctic Ocean coastal states like Canada and Russia, as I've said it before, but notably you have also the European Union and China and Korea, amongst others. So it's a really important agreement. It's trying to set up rules of engagement before commercial fisheries actually take place in the Central Arctic Ocean. They may not take place in the Central Arctic Ocean. It's important to say that. But I think what the parties are trying to do is have a framework in place before fishing happens, because unfortunately there is a history of bad practices in both the Arctic and Antarctic. And we've seen in the past fish stock collapse, whale collapse, seal collapse, and they're trying to, I think, avoid that. One notable element of the agreement is that there are references made to indigenous and local knowledge. And I think one of the really interesting things is going to be is how far the perspectives of indigenous peoples in the Arctic are really taken into account as and when the development and negotiations take place in the Central Arctic Ocean. Quickly moving on to the Arctic Council, established in 1996, very much the 8 Arctic states in the driving seat, and indigenous peoples represented as permanent participants. Observers have been an important element of the Arctic Council. The United Kingdom and France were some of the earliest. In 2013, China, Korea, Singapore, and others join. The Arctic states have a problem. The problem is this. On the one hand, the Arctic Council is hugely important to them alongside permanent participants. because it helps actually to bring them together as a kind of Arctic community. The Arctic Council helps to create the Arctic. But on the other hand, it also wants legitimacy and recognition from what we call extraterritorial parties. The problem is very large parties like China are global powers. So what we see, I think, is China on the one hand wanting to be an observer to the Arctic Council, but on the other hand, as perhaps the moniker Polar Silk Road reminds us, it's really well intentioned in terms of its own global designs, and that means working with smaller Nordic states in particular to leverage economic, geopolitical, scientific, and other forms of advantage. So can the Arctic Council reform itself? I'm not sure that's the right question. I think you should be asking, with respect, how are extraterritorial parties like China bypassing the Arctic Council? That may not be something that sits well with Canadian and other audiences, but I think that's what you should look out for. China wanting to be an observer, doing the formal stuff, but then looking to exert influence in all kinds of other areas.
Okay, thank you for your response. I think the next two questions I'm going to put forth to Cassandra here. Actually, one is specifically on Antarctica. Anish Warrior here, he wants to know, why do countries have multiple research stations in Antarctica? That's the first question. And he has also asked one more question on, what do you think about the presence of microplastics in the waters of the polar region, and how is it impacting the marine ecosystem? Yeah.
Yeah, both great questions. And I guess briefly, the science station. So, and I think Professor Dodds is actually one of the people who have said this, that science is a double-edged sword in Antarctica, where science stations act as a means to occupy space. Antarctica is an international space, and you're not allowed to live there, but you can have permanent research stations. And so politically, they're really important for countries to sort of have scientists on the ground there. But on the other hand, Antarctica is this amazing place for science, where we actually can learn a lot about the global atmosphere, the global system. And so there are multiple science bases so that we can actually understand all the different parts of Antarctica. And for instance, South Pole Station is run by the US, but it's very much an international station where multiple countries work there. And from the South Pole, we learn a lot about the global atmosphere. There's other stations that are based on the coast, studying more coastal processes. And so it's really across the board, depending on what a country is focused on for research. And then I guess to the microplastics, plastics are now a global issue, and there are not great studies on what's happening in the Southern Ocean, but the few studies there are do show that there are microplastics in the Southern Ocean now as well. We do find larger plastic debris, not like we find in the Pacific, but we still find it in coastal areas of Antarctica. So it is a global issue, and so all the things that it's affecting in other parts of the world's oceans, we do expect to see the same impacts in Antarctica. So it's terrible. It's something we need to address on a global level, for sure.
All right, thank you. Okay, the next two questions to Professor Dodds here now. I mean, these are, I think, more pointed towards the Arctic. So I'm just forwarding them to you. In the Arctic, where do you see the most promising opportunities for science diplomacy? The less likely opportunities, for example, is there general interest in the effects of climate change, for instance, or interest, antipathy regarding social sciences of the population, migratory or otherwise? So this is a question from a member of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. And there is another question for you from, okay, I can't find it now. Okay, there is another question from Chitra. She wants to know, would you share your views on the Norwegian government's decision to grant permits for oil exploration near the sensitive offshore province of Svalbard? So those questions for you.
Okay, well, modest questions that just invite brief responses. So very quickly, I think science diplomacy, whether it's in the Arctic or anywhere else in the world, is a movable feast, in the sense that it's not always obvious why you should focus on particular disciplines or particular areas of the world. The sort of area I think that really should invite good science diplomacy would be the international waters of the Central Arctic Ocean, precisely because they are international waters. You would think actually that this would be a great opportunity to involve multinational initiatives. Actually, one of the countries that's very good at thinking about these possibilities is Sweden. So one of the things you learn when you focus on countries like Sweden and Finland, they have a particular comparative advantage, and that is they have decent icebreakers. So the Swedes are very good at using their ship, the Odin, to facilitate mobile science diplomacy. And there's lots of nice images you can find of scientists somewhere near the North Pole being photographed with the Odin in the backdrop, as if to say, look, we don't have an Arctic coastline, but we have an icebreaker and we can go back and forwards in the Arctic marine realm. Now, there are other areas that science diplomacy is tricky. It's tricky, I think, to do work that perhaps explicitly recognizes climate change. In Trump's America, climate change might be somewhat controversial. In Russia, climate change doesn't always find a great deal of favor. Some countries are far more enthusiastic about embracing indigenous peoples and their interests than others. So, for example, in Canada, if you don't talk about indigenous peoples and northern communities and their interests, that science diplomacy is not likely to gain a lot of traction. The situation in Russia, however, is very different. The Russian state does not have as great as interest in the rights of minority communities in the Arctic. So you have to be quite careful and you have to be smart about what kind of science diplomacy you're going to do, frankly speaking. And by the way, whether we like it or not, 50% of the Arctic is Russian. So you can't not take Russia very seriously. And you may not approve of Russia. That's beside the point. That's a really hard geopolitical reality. The second point about Svalbard, talk about hard geopolitical realities. Here's another. Svalbard is a Norwegian territory, but it's governed by a very particular treaty originating from 1920. It entered into force in 1925. If you want to see geopolitics in action, Svalbard is a great place to focus on. And what you quickly discover is that there's a geopolitics of offshore Svalbard, and there's a geopolitics on onshore Svalbard. So whenever Norway does anything involving offshore Svalbard, other countries pay very close attention, and they really watch very carefully whether Norway is exceeding its sovereignty mandate. And I haven't got time to get into the complexities of the Svalbard Treaty, but in essence, whether Norway likes it or not, it has to take into account the other signatories and legitimate stakeholders in Svalbard. The biggest problem is, of course, Russia.
Okay, yeah. So the next question is to Cassandra. Okay, and now this is a question again from a researcher from the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. If I recall, there was a time frame for the exclusive focus on science in the Antarctic Treaty. Is this right? If so, when might Antarctic open for economic activities if the treaty is not updated? How does such a dynamic affect science diplomacy in the Antarctic? So that's a question to you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Actually, thank you for that question. I think it's perhaps one of the most important questions for thinking about Antarctica and now and into the future. And just to be explicitly clear, the Antarctic Treaty is in place indefinitely. It doesn't expire. It can come up for review, and when it does come up for review, then all the countries have the opportunity to think about if they want it to change. But it would take consensus. It would take unanimous agreement of all the countries to make the treaty go away, to make the mining ban go away. And countries continue to reiterate that they support having these agreements in place. And it's very difficult to imagine a future in which all the countries would want the mining ban and the Antarctic Treaty to go away. If you think about even from the perspective of countries that have historic claims, if these agreements go away, then it opens up to everybody. So for those who have claims, they like keeping it in place because it basically protects that no one else can make claims. And then countries who don't have claims like it being in place too for the same reason, because it doesn't give claimants more power. And so everybody seems to like having this sort of agreement in place that no one will mine and no one will exert sovereignty over Antarctica. So I think these things are in place for a while. And in fact, I recently had a conversation with someone who was part of the agreements, the discussions over having a minerals agreement in Antarctica. So this was back in the 80s. There were real discussions over let's mine Antarctica. What would that look like? And he said the big thing was economics. He's like, it doesn't make economic sense to go mine Antarctica. There's no infrastructure. It's too expensive. We simply don't have things in place to do it. So I find comfort in that, like knowing that we have a legal agreement in place, and then also that economically it just doesn't make sense. It still makes sense to fish, and I think people will continue fishing and probably pushing for more fishing, but nobody can mine there, and certainly nobody can live there or stake claims there. So the treaty agreements are in place indefinitely, and I think that part of it is stable. What some people say, which I think is worth thinking about, is will the treaty continue to be effective? Will it be effective at actually protecting the continent and the oceans? Or will there be too much other, because we don't have regulations over bioprospecting. We don't have regulations really for tourism. And the fishing regulations are good, but they're being compromised. And so those are the real questions of like, will the treaty actually be effective at doing what it's supposed to do? And I think that's a bigger question. Not will the treaty go away? I don't think it'll go away, but will it actually do what it says it is supposed to do, which is to keep Antarctica preserved for peace and science, and to protect the environment there as well. So.
Okay. We don't have enough time, but I'm just going to squeeze in one last question before I wrap up the session. This is to Professor Dodds. I mean, it's not particularly addressed to any one speaker, but then I think, Professor Dodds, you can probably just answer this question. What is the probability of resorting to geoengineering in polar regions, particularly in the Arctic, and how feasible it is, in terms of tackling climate change? Because this is something that is coming up in most of the discussions these days on geoengineering governance. So that's the question.
I'm no great expert on geoengineering, and I won't pretend I have a sort of profound answer here. Let me just make a couple observations. First of all, there's been no shortage, unfortunately, particularly in the Arctic, of previous attempts to geoengineer it. So throughout the Cold War, there was plenty of research, interest, speculation, crazy scheming to change the ecologies of the Arctic region. Most notoriously, plans to nuclear engineer Alaska's coastline to create so-called natural harbors. But there's also been mad plans to use nuclear weapons to bomb sea ice because it was seen as an obstacle. What I think is interesting is that 50 years later, sea ice, which was once regarded as an obstacle, is now a source of profound concern, because actually we're worried about there being less sea ice, that actually the Arctic Ocean is in danger of becoming open water as opposed to a frozen desert. Now, my view is if we really need to talk about geoengineering in places like the Arctic, we are truly in trouble. There are other things we could and should be doing now that do not involve geoengineering. But like your questioner, I have also read all kinds of ideas about how we need to desperately re-ice the Arctic, how we need to encourage all kinds of artificial cloud formation, how we need to reflect sunlight in ever greater ways. It's the stuff of Jules Verne. And I would rather think about other kinds of things closer to home, actually, than look to the polar regions yet again as a space of extreme experimentation, in this case, geoengineering.
All right. Thank you so much for that response. So yeah, it's time to wrap up the session. Although we began with a few glitches, I'm glad it worked out. And there are plenty of other questions that I couldn't really post to the speakers. I'm sorry to those who have posted these questions. Maybe, you can get in touch with the speakers directly if you wish. So that would be a better idea. At this stage, we need to wrap up the session. It's like slightly past 1 hour now. Okay, so thank you to both the speakers, Professor Cassandra Brooks and Professor Klaus Dodds, both of you, for sharing your research and experience of working on polar regions, in the polar regions as well. And your insights have been really great. In fact, some of the speakers, some of the members of the audience have said that, there's lots to actually research on in these areas, especially since these are areas that are kind of mostly uninhabited, especially in the Antarctic. So there is plenty of things to do in terms of science diplomacy and environmental diplomacy in those regions. So thank you so much for your talks and for answering the questions of all those who managed to actually come online at this time. And I would also like to thank all the other networks and institutions, especially Environmental Peacebuilding Association, which is actually facilitating this webinar. So I would like to thank them. I would also like to end by saying that, okay, we will be posting a blog on this particular webinar, like a brief excerpt on what the speakers talked about and the discussion that happened thereafter. And we will put up the link so that if you could not manage to come online during the course of the webinar, or you missed it somehow, you can still manage to watch it. Or if you would like to use it as a resource or something, it's perfectly fine. So this will be done, and I will be sharing the link on Twitter and other social media as well, so that you can have access to it very soon. So thank you very much, and have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.